It was the most devastating technical criticism possible, being told by the king of bebop trumpet that you didn't have the chops to play real jazz. Dizzy represented everything that 1940s jazz valued: speed, complexity, technical virtuosity that left audiences breathless. Miles represented something different: restraint, emotion, the power of what you didn't play. The confrontation that followed became a battle between two completely different definitions of trumpet mastery. It was a humid August evening in 1949 at the Royal Roost in New York City, and the club was packed with jazz enthusiasts, eager to hear the greatest trumpet players of their generation. The venue had become legendary for hosting cutting sessions, informal competitions, where musicians would test their skills against each other in front of live audiences who served as both witnesses and judges. Tonight's lineup was particularly impressive. Dizzy Gillespie, at 31 years old, was at the peak of his powers as the undisputed master of bebop trumpet. His technical abilities were considered supernatural by fellow musicians. He could play faster than anyone had ever imagined possible. His range extended into notes so high they seemed to exist in a different atmospheric pressure, and his harmonic knowledge allowed him to navigate the most complex chord changes with ease and creativity. Miles Davis, 23 years old, and still establishing his reputation, was also scheduled to perform. Miles had been making a name for himself as an innovative player, but his approach was dramatically different from Dizzy's. Where Dizzy emphasized technical virtuosity and rapid-fire complexity, Miles was developing a style based on restraint, space, and emotional directness. The differences between their approaches had been the subject of discussion in jazz circles for months. Some musicians and critics argued that Miles's more restrained style represented a maturation of bebop principles, while others suggested that it was simply a limitation, that Miles couldn't match the technical demands that Dizzy had established as the standard for modern jazz trumpet. As the evening progressed, both trumpeters had performed their individual sets to enthusiastic responses from the audience. Dizzy had dazzled the crowd with his characteristic virtuosity, playing Salt Peanuts at a tempo that left other musicians shaking their heads in amazement. His high notes soared above the rhythm section like declarations of technical supremacy, and his rapid-fire improvisation demonstrated why he was considered the most technically accomplished trumpet player in jazz. Miles had taken a completely different approach during his set, playing Autumn Leaves with a cool restraint that emphasized melody and emotional expression over technical display. His use of space and silence created dramatic tension that drew the audience into an intimate musical conversation. Where Dizzy overwhelmed listeners with his technical brilliance, Miles invited them into a more subtle and contemplative musical experience. After both sets were complete, Dizzy approached Miles at the bar where he was nursing a drink and trying to decompress from his performance. "Miles," Dizzy said, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who had never doubted his own technical supremacy, "we need to talk about something." Miles looked up, immediately sensing that this wasn't going to be a casual conversation between fellow musicians. Dizzy's expression had the intensity that Miles recognized from their recording sessions together. But there was something different this time, a mixture of frustration and concern. "What's on your mind, Diz?" Miles asked, trying to keep his voice neutral despite the growing tension he felt. Dizzy sat down on the bar stool next to Miles and looked directly at him with those penetrating eyes that had intimidated countless musicians over the years. "Miles, you can't play fast and high," Dizzy said, his words cutting through the ambient noise of the club like a surgical blade. The accusation hit Miles with the force of a physical blow. To be told by Dizzy Gillespie that he lacked the fundamental technical skills required to be a serious jazz trumpeter was like being told by Einstein that he couldn't do basic mathematics. "What are you talking about, Diz?" Miles said, his voice showing the first signs of the defensive anger that was building inside him. Dizzy leaned closer, and Miles could see the concern in his eyes that seemed to be driving this confrontation. "Miles, bebop requires certain technical standards. You need to be able to navigate complex harmonic progressions at rapid tempos. You need to have the range to play the high notes that give the music its excitement and energy. And most importantly, you need to have the speed to keep up with the rhythmic demands of modern jazz. Dizzy paused, then delivered the criticism that would stay with Miles for the rest of his career. What I heard tonight during your set wasn't bebop. It was nice, it was musical, but it wasn't the kind of technical virtuosity that defines what we're trying to accomplish in modern jazz. You're playing it safe because you can't handle the real technical demands of the music. Miles felt his jaw tighten as he processed the full implications of Dizzy's criticism. This wasn't just a disagreement about musical style. Dizzy was questioning Miles's fundamental competency as a jazz musician. "Diz, what I'm doing isn't about avoiding technical challenges," Miles said, his voice tight with controlled frustration. "I'm trying to find different ways to express musical ideas that don't require showing off every technical skill I possess." Dizzy shook his head, his expression showing that he wasn't convinced by Miles's explanation. "Miles, that's exactly my point. Jazz is about pushing the limits of what's possible on your instrument. If you're not constantly challenging yourself technically, you're not growing as a musician. You're settling for what's comfortable instead of striving for what's excellent." The conversation was beginning to attract attention from other musicians in the club. Miles could see trumpet players like Fats Navarro and Kenny Dorham watching their exchange, probably wondering whether they were witnessing a friendly discussion or a serious confrontation. "Diz, there's more than one way to achieve excellence on the trumpet," Miles said, his voice becoming stronger as he found his footing in the argument. "Speed and range are important, but they're not the only measures of musical value." Dizzy's response was swift and pointed. "Miles, in bebop they are the primary measures. If you can't play Cherokee at 300 beats per minute with perfect intonation and harmonic accuracy, you don't belong on the same bandstand with musicians who can. If you can't hit the high F sharp that gives Salt Peanuts its excitement, you're limiting the musical possibilities available to the band." The technical standards Dizzy was describing represented the pinnacle of bebop trumpet achievement. Miles knew that very few musicians in the world could meet those demands consistently, and he also knew that he wasn't one of them. "Diz, what if there are other ways to create excitement and musical interest that don't require those specific technical achievements?" Miles asked, trying to defend his approach without directly admitting his technical limitations. Dizzy looked at Miles with an expression that mixed disappointment with genuine concern for a fellow musician's career development. "Miles, that's like saying there are other ways to be a great boxer that don't require being able to throw a powerful punch. The technical demands of bebop aren't arbitrary obstacles. They're the tools that allow us to express the full complexity and beauty of the music we're trying to create." Miles realized that Dizzy wasn't just criticizing his playing. He was defending an entire philosophy about what jazz should be and what it required from its practitioners. To Dizzy, technical virtuosity wasn't showing off. It was the foundation that made sophisticated musical expression possible. "But Diz," Miles said, "what if focusing too much on technical display actually gets in the way of emotional communication? What if all that speed and complexity creates a barrier between the musician and the audience?" Dizzy's eyes flashed with the intensity that had made him one of the most compelling improvisers in jazz history. "Miles, that's backwards thinking. Technical mastery gives you the freedom to express any musical idea you can imagine. When you have complete control over your instrument, you can focus entirely on the musical content without worrying about whether you can execute your ideas." Dizzy stood up from his bar stool and gestured toward the bandstand, where they had both performed earlier that evening. "When I play Cherokee at breakneck speed, I'm not showing off. I'm demonstrating that bebop can maintain harmonic sophistication and rhythmic complexity even under the most demanding technical conditions. That's what makes it revolutionary compared to the simpler jazz that came before it." Miles understood what Dizzy was saying, but he also felt that there was something missing from this purely technical definition of musical excellence. "Diz, I understand the value of technical mastery, But what I'm trying to develop is a different kind of sophistication, one that uses space and restraint to create emotional impact that might be even more powerful than technical display. Dizzy sat back down and studied Miles's face, trying to understand whether this was a genuine philosophical position or simply a rationalization for technical inadequacy. Miles, give me an example. Show me how restraint can be more powerful than virtuosity. Miles thought for a moment, then offered an analogy that he hoped would help Dizzy understand his approach. Diz, think about the difference between a speaker who talks as fast as possible, using the most complex vocabulary they can manage, versus a speaker who chooses each word carefully and uses silence to create emphasis. Both might be expressing sophisticated ideas, but they're communicating in completely different ways. Dizzy nodded slowly, beginning to see that Miles was articulating a legitimate alternative approach rather than simply making excuses for technical limitations. That's an interesting way to think about it, Dizzy said. But music isn't the same as speech. The technical demands of bebop serve specific musical purposes that can't be achieved through restraint alone. Miles realized that this conversation was about more than just his individual approach to the trumpet. They were discussing fundamental questions about the direction of jazz and what it meant to be an innovative musician. Diz, what if bebop represents one phase in the evolution of jazz, but not the final destination? What if the music needs to continue growing and changing, even if that means developing in directions that don't prioritize the same technical standards you've established? This suggestion clearly troubled Dizzy, who had devoted his career to perfecting the bebop approach and establishing it as the pinnacle of jazz sophistication. Miles, bebop isn't just a phase, it's a fundamental advancement in musical language. The technical standards I'm talking about aren't arbitrary. They're necessary tools for expressing the harmonic and rhythmic complexity that makes modern jazz intellectually and artistically significant. Miles could see that Dizzy genuinely believed technical virtuosity was essential to artistic advancement, while Miles was beginning to believe that different kinds of sophistication might be equally valid. Diz, I'm not arguing against technical skill. I'm suggesting that there might be multiple paths to musical excellence, and that the one I'm exploring might have value even if it doesn't meet the specific technical standards that bebop has established. The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, with both musicians defending their approaches to the instrument and their philosophies about what made jazz meaningful. Other trumpet players gradually joined the discussion, sharing their own perspectives about the relationship between technical ability and artistic expression. As the evening wound down, Dizzy made one final attempt to convince Miles that technical mastery was the foundation for any serious musical achievement. Miles, I'm not trying to discourage your musical development, but I am trying to make sure you understand what's required to be taken seriously as a jazz musician. If you can't play fast and high, you're going to be limited in what you can accomplish and who will want to hire you. Miles appreciated Dizzy's concern, but he was beginning to develop confidence in his own artistic vision. Diz, I understand your point, but I'm starting to believe that what makes a great musician isn't just technical ability. It's the capacity to create something meaningful and original, whatever technical approach that requires. 6 months later, Miles's prediction began to be validated, when his recordings with the birth of the Cool sessions demonstrated that his restrained approach could generate significant critical acclaim and commercial interest. The music he created emphasized exactly the qualities that Dizzy had questioned: space instead of speed, emotional directness instead of technical complexity, accessibility instead of virtuosic display. The success of cool jazz proved that there was indeed an audience for sophisticated music that prioritized different values than bebop. Miles's approach attracted listeners who found bebop's technical demands intimidating, while still maintaining enough harmonic sophistication to satisfy serious jazz enthusiasts. When Dizzy heard Miles's recordings from the birth of the Cool sessions, he began to understand that Miles hadn't been making excuses for technical inadequacy. He had been articulating a genuinely different approach to musical expression that had its own artistic merits. Years later, when young musicians would ask Dizzy about different approaches to jazz trumpet, he would reference his conversation with Miles as a lesson in artistic diversity. Miles taught me that there's more than one way to master the trumpet. Speed and range are important, but so are space and emotion. The music is big enough for multiple approaches. Miles, for his part, never stopped working to improve his technical abilities, but he also never abandoned his belief that musical communication was more important than technical display. His approach influenced an entire generation of musicians who learned that artistic excellence could be achieved through restraint and emotional directness, as well as through virtuosic complexity. The confrontation between Dizzy and Miles became a classic example of how artistic traditions evolve through the tension between established standards and innovative alternatives. Both approaches, Dizzy's technical virtuosity and Miles's emotional restraint, contributed essential elements to jazz's continued development. The lesson from their debate extends far beyond music. It demonstrates that excellence in any field can be achieved through multiple paths, and that apparent limitations can sometimes be transformed into unique strengths when approached with creativity and confidence. Miles' response to Dizzy's technical criticism proved that the most important skill for any artist isn't meeting established standards, but developing the vision and courage to create new standards that serve different artistic purposes. If this incredible story of artistic courage and the multiple paths to excellence inspired you, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that technical mastery and artistic genius can take many different forms. Have you ever been told you lacked the technical skills required for your field, only to find success through a different approach? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to check out more stories about the moments when artistic innovation required redefining what mastery really meant.